My father was a trucker and a veteran of the Vietnam War. He wasn't a weak person, and he wasn't one to tell crazy stories. Once back in the 1970s, he had to drop off an empty trailer to a private home in northern Minnesota. He decided after he dropped it off to stop in and visit with a former service buddy. Logan, Dad's friend, got a little messed up by his time in Vietnam, and it turned him into a hermit who never left his property. He owned a good-sized piece of land with a home on it that had inner walls made of ammo boxes filled with sand. Well, they spent a happy afternoon drinking beer and reminiscing about their time in Vietnam and catching up on all that they had done since coming back to the States. At the end of the day, my father decided to sleep in the cab of his truck so that he could leave early without waking Logan. It was 11 p.m. when he walked out to the tractor, crawled inside, and fell asleep. At 1 a.m., he was rocked out of his bed by something hitting the side of the cab really hard. He was stunned and unsure of what was happening, so he looked around him and he tried to get his bearings. Before he had time to fully register what had happened, the truck was hit again by another loud slam that had him thinking Logan was having flashbacks to the war. Rather than confront his troubled friend, he jumped into the driver's seat and he drove to the nearest truck stop. And there he went inside to use the facilities and get a grip on his thoughts. Now, Logan was his friend, but Vietnam and all that surrounded it played havoc on a lot of soldiers' minds, and Dad didn't want to become another casualty of war. So armed with a hot cup of coffee, he headed back out to his rig, still unsure about whether to go back or move on. And as he rounded the cab, he noticed a huge handprint on it that was 9 feet off the ground. And whatever left the handprint left a dent in the side of the truck to go with that. That was all he needed to make up his mind. He climbed in the truck and he headed home. It was another month before my father called Logan to tell him what had happened that night. "Oh, that was probably just Zeus," Logan answered nonchalantly. Apparently, he neglected to mention to my father that there was a family of Bigfoot living on his property. He assured Dad that he was never in any danger, and Zeus was just letting him know that he was there. Judging by the size of the handprint, my dad was glad he didn't actually go see Zeus. The message he left was enough. My dad kept in touch with Logan. They've remained friends for all these years, but Dad never went to visit him again. Phone calls were enough from him from then on out. We don't speak about our encounters much outside of our family. I've never told anyone about the things that we've seen and heard. It would be useless to do so anyway. Most of the population doesn't believe that Bigfoot exists. Speak about it and people will think you're crazy or self-medicating. And for those people, ignorance is bliss. And for us, their existence is accepted from childhood. Knowing they exist and having one or more of them scream at you, though, are two different levels of reality. We're a family of avid outdoorsmen. I spent more time in a tent in the wilderness growing up than I did in our house. I love being out in the mountains. My husband also grew up spending a lot of time in the mountains. In his 20s, he was a wildland firefighter. Now, that doesn't mean we go out looking for these creatures. We believe they have a right to be left alone like any other being. But for us, it was a matter of being in the right place at the right time. My life was changed forever when we had our first encounter during the summer of 2012. I wouldn't go back into the woods for several months afterward. We had been up in the mountains practicing our archery skills in the surroundings and conditions where we would be using them in September. It was 2 p.m. and despite the cloud cover, it was starting to get hot. I think it was time to pack it in and call it a day. I had moved over to the back of our SUV to put my bow away. My husband took his last shots and had started to walk over to set his bow down so he could retrieve his arrows and the target bag when a loud screaming roar erupted from the tree line behind where we were parked. We've spent ample time in the woods. We've heard our share of animal noises, but this scream was nothing like we had ever heard before. We barely had time to register the first scream when another one came from our other side. A few seconds later, we heard a third scream off to our left. I know what you're probably thinking. It was echo, but I assure you that this was not an echo. Each scream was slightly different. I was momentarily frozen in fear, and as soon as the third scream stopped, however, I was ready to leave. Not much scares me, but that day, I was terrified. 2 years later, in 2014, my husband and I had another encounter. He and my 11-year-old daughter were walking down into what is known as beaver ponds to retrieve our trail cam. I was supposed to go with them that day, but I wasn't feeling well. And by the time we parked, I was feeling bad enough that I decided to just stay in the vehicle. They had 1 mile to 1.5 miles to hike to where we had set up the trail camera. They almost gotten there when my husband heard that scream 50 yards off to their right. "Did you hear that?" he asked my daughter. "Yeah, what was it? Was that a bear, Dad?" she replied. "That wasn't a bear. We need to hurry up and get the trail cam and get out of here," he told her. When they got back to the vehicle, they asked if I'd heard the screams. Well, I'd been lying in the back seat of a locked running vehicle with the air conditioner on. I never heard anything. But judging by the urgency in my husband's voice, I knew what he had heard, and I knew it was time to get the hell out of there. We never explained to my daughter what the screams were, and shortly after that, she went back to live with her dad. I think the way my husband and I reacted to the screams freaked her out. She didn't like going into the woods after that. My husband had one more encounter in 2019. He was traveling back home from working out of state. He was already tired from working all day, and the 7 hours of driving in addition to that prompted him to pull over and get some rest. He picked a small junction off of I-80. It was late winter night in Wyoming with very few vehicles on the road. He only needed an hour or two of rest. Then he planned to finish the drive home to see our little boys and get some real sleep in his own bed. At 2:30 a.m., he woke up and was getting ready to leave again. He was reaching to turn on the lights when he saw an extremely tall, dark figure across the road. At first, he thought it was a person out there walking, but reason told him it was too tall to be a man. The road was icy, but it didn't walk like a person would on ice. It had an assurance in its gait that humans lack. My husband's instincts told him it was time to leave. He told me about the encounter as soon as he got home. We try not to talk about Bigfoot around our 2 little boys, but we do tell them that they are out there and that we need to give them a healthy amount of distance and respect. We want them to understand and respect what they cannot necessarily see, but what they may someday encounter when they get old enough to venture into the wilderness themselves.